Okay, so we have been looking at this idea of enlightenment, and we've been talking a lot about what enlightenment is, and we've talked about some of the things that might help us get there. And if before you thought that enlightenment was this thing that was going to be very far away, very difficult, perhaps after a few hours of meditation today you're thinking, maybe it's even further than I thought. And sure, it's not easy. I haven't got there yet, but I can see that there's the potential for it to be possible and real. It's, for me, when I first began in Buddhism, there was this idea of enlightenment. And often people talk about this and they're like, oh yeah, like I just couldn't understand this amazing mind. And I just kind of didn't really have the full confidence that it was possible. But over time, I've actually developed an understanding of how the mind works, and I can see, even in that description that we have about the upasama nusati, the qualities of enlightenment. Let's just read it again on the first page. This is peaceful, this is sublime. That is the stilling of all activities, the letting go of all attachments, the ending of craving, dispassion, cessation, Nibbana. I think before I even meditated the first time, I had no concept of the potential for peace in my own mind. And this is the first words that the Buddha uses here to describe Nibbana. This is peaceful, sublime. And through my meditation experience, same as you people, I imagine that you've glimpsed some peace in your own mind that you didn't know existed before. People who have begun meditating are incredibly fortunate that they have glimpsed the potential of their mind. Sure, we also see things like the hindrances. It's good to see those, then we can deal with them, right? But when we see things like peace in our mind, we can develop that, we can grow that. So if enlightenment is the highest peace, then we can develop our mind to get it there. Same with the Buddha, he talks about enlightenment as being the highest bliss. Some of you have experienced bliss in your meditation. And it's incredible, right? Like, whoa, my mind is capable of producing this? This is the kind of bliss Ajahn Brahm talks about when he says things like it's better than sex, better than drugs, and that it's just bliss upon bliss upon bliss, right? This is how Ajahn Brahm talks about it. And when I've had some conversations with him, I remember saying that once I just couldn't handle the bliss. It was too much. Literally pushed me over and I couldn't get up. I was like so out of it on bliss. And he's like, you can always handle more bliss. You know, this is the potential of the mind to really experience deep pleasure. And so if I've glimpsed a little bit of that in my own mind, then I have some confidence that it's possible to attain even higher states of bliss, right? If the causes and conditions are correct. I've seen in my own mind stilling, things coming to rest. I've seen it. I've seen things become really still and really just so like everything just stops. Maybe some of you have seen this too. So I can imagine developing a mind that stops. I haven't done that yet. Letting go of all attachments. I've let go of quite a few. Not all of them, but I've seen how it works. I understand it's possible to let go of attachments. And the ending of craving. I still have some craving. I imagine you do too. But even in this short period over this weekend, you've seen that it's possible to let go, for that craving to come to an end. Those things that when you arrived were obsessing your mind, oh, if I had this, why wasn't I doing this thing? I should have that for dinner. You know, you've let go of that. You've seen that craving for those things come to an end in your own mind. So in this way, you start to understand, oh, perhaps like this is just like a spectrum. You know, that the potential for our mind to experience a state like enlightenment is real. It's possible, right? It's not some fairy story. It's not something only the Buddha could do. And remember, again and again, that the Buddha had confidence in us. The Buddha had confidence in us that we could also attain the same enlightenment that he did. That's why he taught. If he didn't think that we were capable of it, he would have just gone and hidden and stayed a private Buddha. Instead, he believed that we were capable of enlightenment. And so this gives me a little bit of a confidence boost. The Buddha believed in me. Maybe I should. And so this state of enlightenment no longer seems to me far off. Well, it does seem far off. No longer seems to me impossible. No longer seems to me something that doesn't apply to me, that I'm not good enough for. I've seen in my own mind little bits, just little glimmers. And I suppose if I keep going, eventually, hopefully, maybe, possibly, who knows, maybe I could get there too. The good news is that it doesn't happen quickly, but it is a gradual process. That's good because, like, I can't expect it just to happen tomorrow or the next day. But if I work towards it, I should get there, right? If we follow the Buddha's teachings, follow the Eightfold Noble Path, the path he said leads to enlightenment, then it's possible, right? It makes sense. It's achievable. So that should bring some confidence into you. And so we're going to look at some of the suttas that talk about this. And so we're on page 8. So some of you are in the dark, you can just listen if you want. And the Buddha tells us about the gradual nature of enlightenment. Mendicants, I don't say that enlightenment is achieved right away. So that's nice to hear, isn't it? So those who are expecting to get enlightened this week, this weekend, the Buddha here is saying, I don't say that enlightenment is achieved right away. Rather, enlightenment is achieved by gradual training, progress, and practice. Gradual training, progress, and practice. There is a whole sequence of gradual training that if we had longer, we could explore. Any of you who's ever gone on one of Ajahn Brahmali's Sutta retreats, this is his constant theme. It's where someone has approached the teacher, listens and things like that, and we find a little bit of it in here. Just how is enlightenment achieved by a gradual training, progress and practice? It's when someone in whom faith has arisen approaches a teacher. They pay homage, lend an ear, hear the teachings, remember the teachings, reflect upon their meaning, and accept them after consideration. So it seems interesting to me that there's a little bit of faith before someone approaches a teacher. There's a little bit of confidence that's required. And it could be that perhaps you have heard about the teacher, that they know what they're doing, that they have good students who seem to know what they're doing. In the case of the Buddha, his reputation usually preceded him. Some of his teaching usually preceded him. People heard about some of his teachings. Oh, the Buddha teaches this. Gets you interested, right? You see it in your own mind. Oh, the Buddha says there's suffering. Look at my life. I got suffering. Maybe he knows what he's talking about. And so you approach. Or the very fact that they're a spiritual person, someone giving some spiritual teachings might encourage you. You know, I'm a spiritual seeker too. Maybe I've got something to learn. And so you approach a teacher. This is why saddha, faith, is such an important aspect of the path, and spiritual friendship. Having a spiritual friend, a teacher who you can rely upon, who can help move you towards the path, help guide you, show you the way. And so that's why having a good friend, having faith, and the next one, hearing the teachings, is such an important part of the path. So hearing the teachings, you know, you actually, so here they pay homage, lend an ear, and then they hear the teachings. Importantly, the Dhamma is really, really precious, right? It's not ordinary stuff. The things that we hear about the nature of our existence, the things that we hear about practices like sila, ethical conduct, chaga, generosity, these can change your life. I never really understood the value of generosity until I encountered the Buddha's teachings on generosity. And they're so deep and profound. And the Buddha says that generosity is an ornament for the mind and something that's essential, a requisite for enlightenment. So generosity is this practice that goes all the way to enlightenment. And as a white boy growing up in the suburbs, I didn't have access to Buddhist communities to show me how generosity could be practiced, how much excitement and joy there was in being generous. And so when I discovered the teachings, the Dhamma on generosity, it really changed my life. And it's the same with all of these teachings. When you hear them, they have the capacity to change your life. It's not the same with the weather on TV, or entertainment tonight, or political opinion. It's not the same, right? The Dhamma is very profound. Very profound. And so they hear the teachings. So lucky to hear the teachings. And then they remember the teachings. That's the trick, right? So this is something that we kind of approach usually just drop by drop, right? Like sometimes you see people listening to a Dharma talk and they're just kind of letting it wash over them. And part of me understands that approach, like, you know, you're meditating, you want to keep meditating, but you want to listen. You think, well, maybe if I'm meditating and listening, then it's going deeper. Sometimes it might be, but sometimes if you ask these people afterwards, what was that talk about? They're like, oh, you know, and ask them tomorrow, even less clear. So when we think about remembering the teachings, I guess this is why the Buddha taught the same thing over and over and over again. It really chips away at your ignorance and your forgetfulness, and it helps you to remember them. And so this is why I often teach the same suttas, and why I often do things like test people, like what are the 5 opportunities for freedom, right? So it's good to actually remember the teachings, because this is how you internalize them. And I think today in our culture, because we hear so much, because we have such access to the Dhamma in person and online, sometimes we don't take the opportunity to internalize the teachings. We don't do a practice where we kind of like ask ourselves, oh, what was the 3 main points of that teaching? What's something that I'm going to take away from this? We don't engage in that process of reflection and review. which would help us retain a little bit more of the information we've just heard. So it's a good practice if you're a Dharma practitioner who listens to a lot of teachings. Sometimes I take notes. Sometimes I'll ask myself later that day, what were the things that were really important for me about that teaching? What's something I wanted to remember? And then you come back to it. Some people don't like the idea of taking notes, but it's much easier to take notes and refer back to them than it is to try to scroll through an hour and a half Dharma talk to find that thing that you heard. Because you don't want to listen to it all again, right? You just want to find that bit. So sometimes I think notes are quite a good way to remember the teachings. And then sometimes you give yourself a little talking to about them. And here, this is what they're doing. They're reflecting upon the meaning of the teachings. You want to understand them for yourself. This is a process that we go through where we reflect upon the teachings. And this is a very personal journey. And you should all do it in your own ways. Why does this matter to me? What is it about this teaching that affects the way I think about the world, the way I relate to myself? What is it about this teaching that matters to me? And so that's a good way to get to know this teaching in your own mind and apply it to your own life. This becomes that kind of experiential understanding that we need as part of our practice. It goes from being theoretical knowledge, to something that we actually internalize, understand, and can synthesize. So they reflect upon the meaning and accept them after consideration. So don't trust me, don't trust even the Buddha. After you've reflected upon it, considered it for yourself, see for yourself, then accept it, if you can see it for yourself, right? If you can understand it, then accept it. So don't just accept things blindly. Test it, interrogate it. Don't throw stuff out. Like if you can't accept it or you don't understand it fully, but the things that you have heard, see if you can test them for yourself somehow in your own mind. Then enthusiasm springs up. So some of you have spoken to me about this, actually, about periods in your Dharma practice, your spiritual journey, where you have become enthusiastic about the teachings and thrown yourself into it. That might fade after some time, but it probably showed how important it was to you at that time, how life-changing these teachings were, that you really wanted to throw yourself into the practice. And so that enthusiasm is something that from time to time we have to rebuild, because we get bored, we get inured to these things. Our tools become less sharp. We begin to take things for granted. One thing that I've been aware of as I travel around Australia with my project Little Dust, going into regional communities, is how slippery our access to the Dharma is. How easily we can become estranged from our spiritual practice. People in these communities have no center, no temple, no community place to practice their spirituality. They have no monastics to help guide them, no lay teachers to help instruct them. They end up in a kind of spiritual wilderness that city slickers like us might take for granted. We could go anywhere, any suburb, any night of the week and access the Dharma. Even online we can access the Dharma. But coming together like this is very special, very profound, right? And we might take that for granted. The energy that comes supporting our spiritual practice, we might take that for granted, but conditions are changeable. You move away to a new place. Regional Australia, there's nothing. You meditate by yourself for a little while, and then it fades away. You forget. And so it's very important to remember that we are responsible for the enthusiasm of our practice. We can't rely upon external sources, right? We can't rely upon weekly meditations. We can't rely upon good teachers coming. We're responsible for our own journey, and we need to create the energy for that, the enthusiasm for that. And it's not always easy. So we're very fortunate to have good conditions that help support our practice, but they might not always be there. But you're still going to have that enthusiasm to keep making effort. And so they make effort, they weigh up, and they persevere, they keep going, they don't stop. So for many of us, actually quite a lot of you in this room, you're very dedicated spiritual practitioners. I've known you for years, some of you, and you're all such good friends, and I know how regularly you come into contact with the Dharma. And some of you have maybe had a really strong practice in the past, wandered away for a little bit, come back, wandered away again, come back. The important thing is you keep coming back, you keep persevering. And in my own spiritual career, trajectory seems a little bit too straight, you know. In my own spiritual wanderings, meanderings, you know, I would kind of come into contact with the Dharma, then kind of wander over there, come back, and eventually, you know, it kind of got like a whirlpool. But I really missed it. And sometimes it took a lot of energy to get back into it. And, you know, we need to keep on persevering with our spiritual practice. It doesn't mean you need to do things, you know, like go to a community every week or anything like that. You just need to keep in contact with the Dharma somehow so that you keep on persevering. Otherwise, instead of going forward, you start to go backwards. So we need to keep persevering. We need to keep our eye on the prize, on that goal, and work towards it. Persevering, they directly realize the ultimate truth and see it with penetrating wisdom. So this will only happen if we continue to persevere. So we can't just rely upon our past meditation experiences, we can't rely upon teachers, we can't rely upon anything else. We need to persevere ourselves. And sometimes this is a hard thing to hear because we just want someone to help us get there, right? And the Buddha, even himself, he couldn't get people there. They had to get there themselves. He could help, but he couldn't do it for them. So we have to persevere. And so just continuing on here, the gradual nature of enlightenment. So he said that above that this is a gradual training, so it takes time. And most of you have had a long history of practicing. You've developed a lot of skills and a lot of understanding over the years. And so you're really lucky, you're all in really good place spiritually, because you have had, some of you, like 10, 15, 20 years of Dharma exposure. And this is a huge reservoir of knowledge that you've developed. And again, imagine your mind before you began this journey, the quality of your mind, and the things that you were doing, and how fortunate you are to have found a path that helps you develop your mind. And it's nothing to be dismissive of. Like, there's people I know who ended up, you know, living lives of crime, doing terrible things, getting stuck in jail. Like, we are very fortunate that we've got ethical systems to follow, that we have value in developing our mind. We want to be good people. So this is very lucky. And sometimes I'm in a bit of a kindness bubble, like I'm surrounded by such good people who are really dedicated and sincere. Then I catch a train and I'm like, whoa, like People are mean to, even friends are mean to each other. There's people fighting, there's people throwing children into the train because they don't want custody that weekend, all sorts of stuff, you know, and the world is so brutal out there. But you're very lucky, you're the creme de la creme. You've worked on your mind, you've got these teachings. So you never forget how fortunate you are. So the next one, the Buddha talks again about how there's different ways of practicing, and that, again, this is gradual. So he says, mendicants, that means nuns and monks, when these 4 times are rightly developed and progressed, they gradually lead to the ending of defilements. What for? 1. A time for listening to the teaching. That's now. 2. A time for discussing the teaching. That could be in your own head or with others. 3. A time for serenity. This is samanassa, which Bhante Sujato here is translating as serenity. So it means like for engaging in a meditation subject. So there's a time for meditation. And then the last one, there's a time for discernment. This is vipassana. There's a time for each of these things. And so this is also very useful to know that there's these different approaches to developing in the Dhamma. We don't just do one thing. It's a very dynamic practice, the Dhamma. There's lots of different things that we bring into it. There's a whole heap of stuff that happens in our life outside of this time on the cushion that really matters, like our ethical conduct, our goodness, our kindness, and hearing the teachings, discussing them. These are all different ways that we deepen our knowledge. And then there's a time for meditation, such as a meditation retreat, and a time for insight or discernment that arises out of meditation, or different practices that hit at different parts of the things that we need to develop on the path, such as doing things like death contemplation or body contemplation, these sorts of things. So there's a time for all of these things. And as practitioners, sometimes we can become very boring. We can. We're like, okay, now it's time to meditate. And I just do the same thing I did yesterday, the same thing I did the day before. I use the same technique. It's familiar, it's comforting, but you kind of reach a plateau, right? And I think this is because we've come to an age where there's a meditation method that is taught, and we think, okay, I just do the method, I just do the technique, that's what I do. And sometimes it ends up telescoping our world a little bit. We become a little bit shut down. No, this is the practice I do, this is the one I do. And then we neglect all of these other aspects of the path. So remember that the Buddha didn't teach a method, he taught students. And he would teach students different things at different times, depending on what was necessary for them to hear. He also taught 40 different subjects of meditation. And so it's not that we need to be really fractured and do 1,000 things. We need to know what the right thing to practice is at the right time. And so some of these are really obvious, like if you've got a lot of lust coming up, for example, you might do some of the Asubha practices. If you've got a lot of hatred coming up, then you might practice something like metta. Right? So this is a dynamic practice. And also part of that dynamism is being responsive to your needs. Like if the idea of sitting down and doing more anapanasati just fills you with boredom, do something different, right? If you're like, oh, this is such a slog, do something different that inspires your mind. You want to be engaged in your spiritual practice, participating in it, teaching yourself, knowing what you need. And this is quite hard sometimes, because we just get stuck in a rut and we just do the same things. And we expect the same results that we used to get. But our mind has changed. Something has changed, right? This is like Buddhism 101, impermanence. Nothing stays the same. Same with our meditation technique. Sometimes we might need to sharpen our tools. They've become blunt. We might need new tools to help us practice. And so there's a time for this. There's a time for that. And this is what the Buddha is saying here. There's a time for listening to the teachings, getting inspired. There's a time for discussing them, helping you understand them. There's a time for meditation, and there's a time for insight, discernment. And he gives this beautiful analogy. It's like when it rains heavily on a mountaintop and the water flows downhill to fill the hollows, crevices and creeks. As they become full, they fill up the pools fill up the lakes fill up the streams, and the streams fill up the rivers. And as the rivers become full, they fill up the ocean. In the same way, when these 4 times are rightly developed and progressed, they gradually lead to the ending of defilements, Nibbana. Gradually, yeah? Takes a long time for the rain falling on the mountaintop, filling up all the streams, filling up the lakes, filling up the rivers, going all the way to the ocean. I remember hearing a little while ago, remember how there was heaps of rain in New South Wales and Queensland area a little while back? Like maybe months and months and months ago. And those waters were only just about to hit somewhere down in like South Australia or somewhere. I remember Lake Eyre. And I was like, what? Like, that was months ago, yeah? It took a long time for this to happen. It's gradual. It's gradual. And so it takes time. We need to hear the teachings over and over and over again. Discuss, you know, do lots of meditation. Develop that insight. Yes?
Okay, just a quick question. You know how it says here in the previous one, it says, lend an ear, hear the teachings. Just wondering, you know how they sort of advise that when you're reading the suttas, it's better to actually read it out loud compared to just reading it silently?
Yeah,
Do
so
you think that there's...
I don't know, like, for me, I always feel a bit weird talking to myself.
Yeah, I do too.
So I think the reason, maybe, is this Bhante Sujato saying this?
No, I think it was like, you know, there's that website, Reading Faithfully.
Oh yeah, so yeah.
Says, oh yeah, when you're reading it, you know, read it out loud.
Yeah. And so I think it's a good strategy actually, because it might kind of transform the experience of reading a sutta, making it distinct from things like reading the news on a website or whatever other kind of way you receive information. Like sometimes it's good to treat the Dhamma differently, or to do it a slightly different way to make it more meaningful. Because it's very tempting, isn't it? When you've got Sutta Central up and you've got the mouse and you can just scroll, right? And it's like, well, I don't know how much penetration we're getting there. And even reading a book is the same thing. You can skim, right? But reading might stop you from, you know, skipping the bits, or it might make it more meaningful and more real to you. So I guess there is that. I think when we approach the Dhamma, we want to make it more meaningful somehow. Yeah. So I often think back to the time of the Buddha, when there was no books, no phones, like I had the entire Tipitaka on my phone, right? Like, wow, can you imagine the monks at the time of the Buddha? They had to learn all of these things and remember them. Amazing, right?
Someone had to help teachers know how to help students with reading.
Yes, that's right.
Researching this.
Yeah.
It actually invokes different parts of your brain, which and so even if you don't actually voice it, it's called subvocalizing. The movement of your lips. The MRIs show other parts of your brain engaged than if you just read. So yes, it makes a difference.
And for me also, because I'm a very visual person, I started to collect images from the suttas, and I found that's the way that I've managed to remember them. You know, like that image of the glass bowl of water, of these hindrances. You know, it's very, very makes a very deep impression, much more than just reading. So yeah, doing these, I guess, different intelligences. You know, trying to draw upon all of these different learning strategies. I think it's very useful to actually make it somehow matter more to you, and to just.
Reading out aloud, and at the same time, visually, you are also reinforcing the two senses.
Yes, so yeah, two senses. Yeah. And so there are, on Sutta Central, for example, if you're interested in the suttas, then you can go to Sutta Central, and there's Sutta Central Voice, and this is where a robot will talk to you. I have found her to sound slightly drunk, but I think it's the speed at which I was playing her. So I think you can speed it up. I know, that's terrible. Don't tell Bhante Sujato. Oh no, cut it. Anyway, the point being, this is a beautiful simile, right? And this is a simile that the Buddha often uses. You find it in the simile of generosity, the rain cloud. You also find it, another simile where the Buddha is talking about hearing the teachings, like the rain on the mountaintop, and it goes down, and it takes time, very gradually, it fills up the ocean. So in the same way, all of the things that we've heard, drop by drop, by drop, by drop, many drops, we are filling up our enlightenment ocean, right? We are actually making some progress, even though it may seem really difficult to see our progress, which is why I've said a couple of times on this retreat, think back before you heard the Dharma, the quality of your mind then, and compare it to now. Think back about your ignorance then, and the knowledge you have now. You have made an extraordinary growth spiritually, and this is drop by drop by drop. You've been filling up, filling up, filling up. And so to acknowledge that is good, because this will help inspire you to keep going. Yeah, to continue. And it's gradual, so don't get impatient. It takes time. Another image the Buddha uses to describe how this gradual process is like the gradual sloping of the ocean's floor. And so the Buddha says that the ocean's floor keeps going at an angle like this and doesn't have a sudden precipice. So let's forget about continental shelves. But this is what happens. This is what actually happens from the top of that mountain where that water goes all the way down. It's going down because there's a slope in the earth, right? That carries the water down to the ocean. And it keeps sloping. You've done this. You've walked on the beach out into the ocean. It's gradually getting deeper and deeper and deeper. In the same way, the Buddha says, the ocean gradually slants, slopes and inclines with no abrupt precipice. In the same way, in this teaching and training, the penetration of enlightenment comes from a gradual training, progress and practice, not abruptly. This is the first thing that mendicants love about the teaching and the training. So again, that gradual training, I wish I had time to go into it more thoroughly. You can find it in suttas such as the Chula Hatipatopama Sutta, the sutta of the shorter simile of the elephant's footprint, and quite a few other suttas where the Buddha describes this long journey from hearing the teaching, approaching a teacher, hearing the teachings, to developing things like sense restraint, contentment, to developing stages of meditation and stages of enlightenment. It's a long journey. And within that, there's a lot of things such as ethics, shorter sections on ethics, large sections on ethics, and that sort of thing. So all of this comes together in this gradual training. It's all changing the mind somehow. So that first one that I read there about, that one I just read about the ocean slanting is from the Paharada Sutta, which is in the Anguttara Nikaya 8, and it's about the ocean. And the Buddha is talking about why the asuras, the demons, love the great ocean. So in Buddhist cosmology, there's a great ocean, and that's kind of where the asuras live, and they love it. And so he's talking about all these qualities of the ocean, and he's comparing it to the qualities that he teaches of the Dhamma. So that's just to help contextualize this next one, which I touched on yesterday about the stages of enlightenment. For all the world's streams that reach it and all the rain that falls from the sky, the ocean never empties or fills up. In the same way, though several mendicants become fully extinguished through the element of extinguishment, with nothing left over, the element of extinguishment never empties or fills up. So the ocean kind of stays relatively stable, right? Apart from global warming and things like that. So the Buddha is saying, it never empties, never gets overly full. In the same way, when a person has become extinguished, the Nibbana element, the Nibbana Dhatu, doesn't change. It stays the same. The idea of Nibbana, the state of Nibbana, isn't affected by people achieving it. They've gone, they've vanished, So that stays the same potential. And he also goes on to say in this sutta, many great beings live in the oceans. And here's Bhante Sujato again using a word like leviathan, which I guess is like a big fish, a giant whale. And beings that would eat even these large creatures, leviathan gulpers, he's calling them here, and even beings that would eat those as well, leviathan gulpers. There's demons, that's the asuras, dragons, nagas, and fairies. I think that might be, maybe, yeah. So in the ocean, there are life forms 100 leagues long, or even 200, 300, 400, 500 leagues long. It's very long. They have actually discovered these colonies of, I want to say jellyfish, but that's not right. Yeah. Is that right? Yeah, so there's those, but there's also ones that kind of join together and like these are these superstructures. So who knows what lies in the ocean, right? In the same way, great beings live in this teaching and training, and these are those beings. So here you see he's making a analogy between all the different types of beings that exist in the ocean and the types of beings that live in the Dhamma. And so these beings are the stream enterer. Remember I talked about the stream enterer yesterday, the lowest stage of enlightenment? Still pretty high. So there's the stream enterer who has penetrated and overcome the 3 lower fetters of self-view, doubt, and reliance upon rites and rituals. So that's the stream enterer. So there's the stream enterer and the one practicing to realize the fruit of stream entry. So we have in the 4 pairs and 8 individuals, Chattari Purisa Yugani Atta Purisa Pugala, what we chant in the morning, that's the Arya Sangha, the 4 pairs, Chattari Yugani is the pairs of beings, the 8 types of individuals. And this is what we're talking about here. These are the classes of enlightened beings. And so we have the path leading to each stage, and then the person who has attained the fruit. So we have the path leading to stream entry, and then someone who has attained stream entry, they have the fruit. We have the path leading to once return, and someone who has attained the fruit. Path leading to non-return, and someone who has attained the fruit. Path leading to arahantship, and someone who has attained the fruit. So we talk about these 8 individuals in terms of paths and fruits. And so we have the people on the way to stream entry. Could be any of you, right? Right? Could be anyone. We have 2 categories of beings in particular, the Dharmanusari and the Saddhanusari. The Dharmanusari is a person who practices the Dharma, thinks about the Dharma, ponders the Dharma, and this helps him get to the stage of stream entry. We also have the Saddhanusari, the person who has a lot of faith and confidence and practices the Dharma, and this helps him get to that stage of stream entry. So stream entry is, like I said yesterday, this breakthrough where if you attain this stage, then you must continue all the way to full enlightenment. It's impossible for you to be reborn in the lower realms, and it's impossible for you to not make it to full enlightenment. You have to make it there, the Buddha says, within 7 lifetimes. That's the momentum that you've gained by breaking through. Your insight has weakened those defilements, has weakened your ignorance, strengthened your knowledge and understanding, so that you can never go back, you can only go forwards. We see this, actually, this momentum in our own meditation practice from time to time. There's stages where your mind will advert to you, and you'll know piti is coming, and then the piti will appear. So there's this kind of momentum that can happen in your meditation where you recognize that it's kind of inevitable, inexorable. And so this is good to understand, both from how meditation works, is putting the causes and conditions in place, but also how the path works. Put the causes and conditions in place, and this is the result. And so we have these beings, right? The stream enterer and the ones practicing to realize the fruit of stream entry. The once returner and the one practicing to realize the fruit of once return, and so on. So sometimes these enlightened beings, I don't know how many you know, right? It's hard to know who's enlightened, right? It's hard to know who's a stream enterer. And that lack of access to good teachers might make us doubt that these states are possible. And for quite a few centuries, I think, it was believed that these paths and fruits were closed, that they were no longer available. But the Dharma has continued, and there's good practitioners everywhere. So these stages of enlightenment, where do we need to aim, do you think? We're going to aim for the top, or we're just going to be like hoping to kind of break through at the bottom? Like, for me, I'm aiming not for full arahantship. I'm just aiming, like, I just hope I can get to stream entry. And I think this is probably pragmatic. This is actually what requires the most effort. And an analogy that sometimes I use is of the voyage to the moon. So there's not a lot of people who have walked on the moon, right? There's not a lot of arahants. So going back, you know, here we are on planet Earth, reading the plans to build a spaceship. That's where we're at the moment. We've got to read the plans, you know, we've got our Lego set, got our Meccano, and we're just trying to put together our spaceship, but we're still just reading the plans, let alone building it. And then the energy that is required to break through to stream entry is like that incredible force lifting up to get out of the Earth orbit, right? This is what we need to do. We need to break through that constraining, that limiting, that oppressive state that we've been living in for countless lives throughout samsara, right? So there's a lot of effort that's going to be taken to get out of Earth orbit. That's where all of that energy that rocket needs to take with it up into space. It's heaps of effort to break through. Once you kind of break through, you're on your way, right? You just go, psh. You don't need a lot of energy to actually get to the moon. And so breaking through the Earth's atmosphere is like stream entry, right? But you're on your way. By the time you get to the moon, you're slackening those other two defilements, the greed and the hatred, which are part of the 5 lower fetters. Remember, it's not abandoned until non-returner. So a once returner still has greed and hatred, ill will. And this the slackening, though, as you get further and further away from Earth, it's becoming weaker and weaker. And then touching down on the moon in the spaceship, this is like a non-returner. That's when greed and ill will is abandoned completely. And you're still not there yet, though. You've got that one final step, which is just so small at that stage, right? Just to walk out onto the moon. And that's when the 5 higher fetters of desire for gross form, a desire for fine material form, restlessness, conceit, I am, I'm good, I'm better than you, I'm less than you, I'm equal to you. This is manas, conceit. And then the last one, of course, that needs to go, ignorance. Even though you have perhaps already become a stream enterer, maybe even a once returner, you still have ignorance that is only, very subtle level ignorance, that is only overcome. And the same with restlessness, right? We think of restlessness as something which is like a really gross hindrance, and for us it is. But even before that person becomes an arahant, they're still experiencing this very subtle restlessness and desire for form, desire for bodies, wanting to do something, the mind looking for something to do. And this is extinguished at full enlightenment. And so that's the progress that we're doing here. We're trying to get to the moon. And so it is a long way away. And so instead of like focusing on the moon, like stepping onto the moon, we should probably be making sure our plans are all good and starting to build our rocket, right? And this is the kind of energy, this is where we need to place our energy if we want to get up into orbit, out of orbit, beyond Earth atmosphere. I don't know much about space. So that's the stages of enlightenment. And to help you, I think the Buddha gave us the Sangha Nusati, to inspire our minds, that recollection that we do, that chanting in the morning of the Sangha and the qualities of the Sangha. And so this is a way that we can kind of have confidence that there are beings who have understood the Buddha's teachings for themselves. They've understood the Dhamma. one of the favourite places that I find for inspiration is in the Therigatha, the stories of the nuns, enlightened nuns at the time of the Buddha, and the Therigatha, stories of the enlightened monks. And these are personal stories where people tell us about their enlightenment experience. And sometimes they're very beautiful, like the Bhikkhuni Patachara, who some of you might know had a horrible life. She lost her 2 children and her husband and her family all in one night because of a thunderstorm and because of floods and all sorts of things like snake bites included, and a bird coming down and snatching her children. She went mad, came into the presence of the Buddha, became rehabilitated, became a bhikkhuni, became a great teacher, had hundreds and hundreds of students. And then her story of her enlightenment is so simple and so beautiful. She was washing her feet, and she was watching the water moving from side to side in the foot washing bowl. And that's the moment that she attained enlightenment. Because she saw through something. Of course her mind had been prepared, she'd been training gradually all this time, and then she had this moment where she understood, and perhaps this is just like, these are the impurities being washed out. Something went off in her head, and that was her moment of enlightenment. We hear things like that. Even I think there's a story about the person sweeping the floor. They understood, this is the defilements, the dust that I'm sweeping, and this is the purity. And that's how they understood the teachings, So enlightenment might not look like, this, it might be something quite different. But it shows the value of preparing the mind on the journey, which is what we've been looking at over the last few days. So it's a little talk about the gradual nature of enlightenment and how we can get there if we keep trying. So I hope it will be of some benefit to you now or in the future. Why don't we have a little break? Are there any questions first? Do you want to ask questions? Yes.
More about the little dust.
So little dust is a thing that I started because I've been going into regional towns across Australia, and people were a little bit desperate for the Dharma, and they kept on giving hints like, "Oh, Bhante, you should come back soon. You should stay for the rains. Oh, Bhante, why don't you come and live here?" And it's like, whoa, we just met. Like we literally just met. And it showed me that there was an incredible thirst for the Dharma, and I became aware of my privilege and the privilege of city-based Dharma practitioners. So even in Australia, where I think access to the Dharma is still quite rare and difficult, compared to somewhere like Thailand or Malaysia or Taiwan, we're a very small percentage of the population here, about 3%, it's very small. And yet it's quite easy to access the Dharma in a city. And so, as I said before, there's Dharma things happening every night of the week, right? And there's Dharma places to practice. There's like physical buildings, there's real estate, and that matters. Because in country Australia, rural towns and rural communities, there is no real estate available. So there is no centre for practice. There is no place for people to go to. Because there's no place to go to, people don't gather. Because people don't gather, they don't connect around their spirituality, and their spiritual practice becomes slackened. And so sometimes it takes something like a visiting monk to bring the community together. And they get excited because they get in touch with something that really matters to them. And so the people I've been working with come from a variety of different backgrounds, mostly diaspora communities. So Sri Lankan, Thai, Cambodian, Burmese, Lao. These people, these brave people, have moved into what used to be white Australia. Like, I remember going to these country towns and being like, oh my gosh, where are the brown people? Like, you know, up until relatively recently, actually. But they are there because it is easier for people to get PR, or because, you know, some of these people have been there a long time. They just saw an economic opportunity to open a business, for example, or to work on the land and things like that. But there's these whole communities of people who don't get to practice the Dhamma, especially like they did in their home country. And there's a real sadness about that. I remember going to Newcastle and connecting with the Newcastle Buddhist community there, mostly Sri Lankan, the people who I was working with. And I got invited to a home a couple of hours away. This woman with 4 kids who had been waiting 8 years to offer food to a monk. She'd been in Australia 8 years. She hadn't had the opportunity to do this very basic cultural practice of offering food to the Sangha. You know, it's a long way to travel to find a monk, right? To go to a temple. Australia's so big. And so there's people who kind of have these stories, you know, went to Orange, and there's some people who've had a business there for many years. They said it's been 10 years since we last had a monk come to our restaurant, you know. And when I was in Rockhampton recently, I met with a Thai community, and they came together again in a restaurant, and they were all so nervous. They invited all their friends. There's about 40 people there, for all ages, from like little ones, who they were trying to show how to bow, why, and things like that, and the older people. And they were also nervous about making a mistake because they couldn't remember what to do. It had been so long since they'd been able to practice. I was like, let's do some chanting, and they were all like, and they're like, oh, Bhante, we're worried, we can't remember. I'm like, you'll be fine. And it was. And, you know, some people had tears in their eyes because they were able to do this spiritual activity that they remembered having a good association with. You know, they grew up going to temple, having fun, running around, eating lots of good food, doing Dharma service, looking after the monks. You know, these things are very celebratory. In Australia, our Dharma centres tend to be very austere and museum-like, but in Asia, you know, they're the centre of the town, the centre of the village. They're really active, vibrant places where people go to have a good time. And they do a lot of events, and it's all exciting. There's festivals, there's colour and movement. And so they miss that. And so to do these practices reminds them perhaps somewhat of their alienation from their home culture, and also their alienation from their spiritual practice. So I decided that what I would do for the next couple of years is to live as a wandering monk and to go from place to place working with these communities. And I wanted to do that to let them know that they were meaningful to me, and that I valued them, and that I wanted to help them practice their spiritual path. You know, in the city, I'm just another monk next to the great Bhante Sujato. I'm practically invisible. But out there, you know, the people, they really respect me for going there, and they really are very grateful, very sincerely grateful. Because great monks like Bhante Sujato, they don't have time for this kind of thing, right? And so I've really been enjoying going into these communities and connecting with them and forming these relationships. And I hope that they'll last a long time, and that I'll be able to take other people, other monks and nuns, to work with these communities too, so that they have access to the Dhamma. So one of the things that we do with Little Dust is we raise money, and this is not a pitch, I'm not asking you for money. We raise money to do things like hire community halls so that people can come together to practice, because that cost is sometimes prohibitive to communities. They can't afford it. When I was in Rockhampton, we were meant to have a residential retreat at a caravan park. Rockhampton's pretty rough. We were going to Yeppoon, even more rough, to do a retreat in a caravan park, right? How lucky we are to have Vejjasala, right? And people couldn't afford to pay for that. So we had to change, and we had to have a non-residential retreat. Sometimes people can't afford the service fee, I think, or the services fee. Like, you know, sometimes organisations will charge a fee for things like food or electricity so they can cover their costs. You know, sometimes people can't afford to do that. Some people can't afford to go on retreats because they are on low incomes. You know, if you're working as a casual, you have to take time out of your work, you don't get paid, and then you have to spend money on accommodation and food. So you go on a retreat, you might be spiritually more wealthy, but fiscally more poor. And this is a real barrier. And so not only do I increase access in terms of physical access to the Dharma for communities, but also in terms of financial support. And although it's true that today we have things like free online Dharma, a lot of these communities don't even know how to access that because they're just out of the loop. And a lot of the people I've been working with are not necessarily even Buddhist, but kind of like Buddhish. And they're interested in crystals. This is mostly the white Australians. They're interested in crystals, they're interested in occult stuff, they're interested in spirituality, but they haven't found a path. They're in the middle of rural Queensland, you know? And we might think, oh yeah, we're creating so much access by having all this online Dharma and stuff, but you know, it's so difficult to actually find something that, you know, is a good place to start even. And so with these people, when I've been working with them, like 93-year-old women who come from Christian backgrounds, who are interested in spirituality, or you know, the kind of down and out dropouts who are interested in conspiracy theories and, you know, this kind of thing. Like, these are the people who I also work with. And so I call them the Buddhish, or the Bud curious, or the Buddhist adjacent. They're not really Buddhists. And for me, going into these country towns, I've been talking so long, this has been one of the most rewarding and baffling things, because I'm not talking to Buddhists. It's easy to talk to Buddhists about Buddhism, right? Very difficult, very different experience for a monk talking to non-Buddhists about the Dhamma. They'll ask all the hard questions. They'll put you on the spot. They'll interrogate you. They'll tell you what they think. They'll give you, you know, something from some other cultural, religious or spiritual tradition. And so this was kind of surprising and interesting for me, and really rewarding too. I mean, it puts you a bit on edge, but it also puts you on your toes. And it reminded me that the Buddha was not talking to Buddhists either. He was talking to people of all different backgrounds. And so I had to really adjust my teaching. I couldn't give them this kind of stuff. You know, we just talk about very simple things, and we talk in the way that the Buddha gave that gradual instruction, you know, starting with generosity and then ethical conduct, these sorts of things. And so you really had to think very differently about how I taught. But the thing that keeps me going towards those type of people, even though they're hard work and for me it's quite challenging. There's no respect for the Sangha, for example. Like, you know, very humbling experience. Sometimes I might not even eat because they don't understand that this is necessary. And, you know, they'll do all sorts of things like call me darling and sweetie and come up and give me a hug. Pardon?
The 93-year-old lady will call you darling.
She did, yes, yes. Yes, I've had it all. Love, sweetie, darling, mate. Yep. And all sorts of variations of my name. Anyway, so the thing that keeps me going with these communities is that because they're really passionate about spirituality and they're really looking for a spiritual path, when you talk to them about these really deep, profound truths, it has the ability to really kick them up onto a greatly different level of understanding. Whereas I find when I talk to my Buddhist communities, like I could probably only help them a little bit because they already know so much, right? And so I see a lot of potential here with these communities because they're a little bit lost spiritually, a little bit lonely spiritually, and they don't have a lot of guidance. And so, you know, if they continue in that direction with crystals and dolphin music, then they might not make as much progress if they hear even a simple basic teaching on the power of generosity. And so that's kind of an interesting thing for me going into these rural areas.
But you need to write like I've done camping before. You know, camping retreats, like you set up tents.
You know, I love the idea of camping. The reality, actually,
You also rent out cheap in that caravan parks.
yeah.
Some are really free.
Yeah, yeah.
Pay for the electricity as well.
Yeah, it's more the surrounding atmosphere, I think. So the place that I was in last, in Rockhampton, I had tried to tell them about what is suitable accommodation for a monk, but they booked me into this caravan park, which was like this amusement park for kids. There's like water slides, and there's all these teenagers doing knock and run at night and things like that. You know, so of course going into these places, I don't expect a monastery, I don't expect anything fancy, but you know, it's kind of on edge. And so yeah, the experience of having a spiritual place to practice, it just doesn't exist there.
But some national parks do a lot of camping.
Yeah, that's true.
Because the community is not very big, you can have
Yeah.
3 or 4 tents.
And if you want to organize it, that's great. Because it's very difficult for these communities to do that. They don't have experience of running retreats. I recently ran a retreat at a place called Molong. Was anyone on that retreat with me? Molong, no. Yeah, and this was my friend Chris from Central West Buddhists, which was a great inspiration for me to form Little Dust. He was a person who contacted me saying, I want to connect Buddhists in my area. And when he's talking about the Central West of New South Wales, he's talking about Bathurst, Dubbo, Orange, Wellington. These are like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of square kilometres, right? It's like 3-hour drive from Bathurst to Dubbo or something, you know? Like this is huge areas of land, and he's just wanting to connect these people somehow as a group. And there's a lot of people from very different backgrounds. And he was doing this for selfish reasons. He wanted to have a Dharma community for him and his children. He wanted to practice meditation. He wanted to have a group of friends.
But there's a Sri Lankan community in Dubbo.
There is, but the Sri Lankan community doesn't tend to connect with other communities. This is one of the problems in Australia. We have all these diaspora communities who want to have a cultural and language form of Buddhism because they're immigrants, they speak the language, the Dhamma is understood in that language, they want their children to learn that language, they have a cultural background, and that is the Dhamma. But they won't do that with other groups, you know. It's a problem. There's a cliff.
A couple of Sri Lankan families from Dubbo They would actually come all the way to Santi.
That's right. And I've probably met them when I went out to Dubbo, but they wouldn't mix with the other communities. We did do one really good event actually, where we had a day of practice and we had a bit of a mix. But apart from that, I didn't meet any other people from any other different backgrounds. I was invited by the Sri Lankan community and I only met Sri Lankans. So we had these silos of practice. Anyway, so that's Little Dust. Oh, but Chris Molong, yeah. So Chris wanted a retreat. And I was like, well, you've got to organise it. I've never been on a retreat in my life. I was like, oh. So I helped him, I helped guide him, what needed to be done. I did as much of the work that I could do myself, which is not, the teacher's usual job. And we got some people together to come along. We found a retreat centre out at Molong, and I ended up getting COVID actually and couldn't go, which I felt terrible about because it was all my friends. And it was his first retreat. Anyway, he muddled through, and so he managed to give himself his first retreat and also give a community their first retreat together, which I thought was pretty amazing. And then he managed to forget the pain of doing that, and we did another one. And he did it again, he organised it, he did so much of the work for it. And this is what it takes. It takes these community connectors, people who are willing to do the hard work, which is why lately I've been really praising community connectors, people like Meredith and Bronwyn, who have been doing the hard work to get this place ready, people like Tina and Zen, who have been doing so much work bringing communities together for years, trying to get people into the Dharma in so many different ways, and who brought friends with them here. So these community connectors, people who are willing to do the work, without them we would be really lost. And so those community centres, often they'll have one or two people who will contact the other people and bring them together. It's a really grassroots, word of mouth kind of thing. And the Bush Telegraph, they call it. And people find out, that Thai community, gosh, they invited all the Thais in the city, and that was really interesting to see how that happens. And I can't imagine it happening in a big city in the same way. So yeah, that's what it takes to do those kind of projects. And unless people are willing, then it becomes impossible. So in organising a camping event, someone's got to do that, right? Good luck to them. And so what I've been doing is just going into people's homes, going into cafes or restaurants, sometimes hiring a hall. If there's a retreat centre nearby, using that. Good luck in Australia. Anyway, I've been talking forever about Little Dust, but that's what I'm doing. And you can check out my adventures on my blog, on my website, Little Dust. And just to say that word Little Dust comes from that story I told at the beginning of the retreat about the Brahma Sahampati, asking the Buddha to teach out of compassion. And the dust reminded me of the red earth of Australia, this kind of, and thank you for asking that. Next month, I'm off to a place called Kalka. Kalka is, that's South Australia, that's Western Australia, that's the Northern Territory. It's right there, just under the border of South Australia. And I'm going to a really remote community. It's 93 people. And it's an art centre. They have a little art studio made out of corrugated iron and a few other bits and pieces, half a bus, which is where the things are stored and I'm going there to volunteer. with 2 Dharma friends, and they're going to help me, because monks are a bit of a hard work, we need to eat, can't help ourselves. So they're going to help, and we're all going to volunteer at this place. We've been invited by a friend of ours who works there. And so this is part of my work for the Buddhist Council, and is my own personal journey this year, especially with the voice. Really wanting to hear from our First Nations people, bring back that to other people, so that I can share what it is that they want us to hear. So I'm just going out there to volunteer, to listen, to learn, and apparently it's a very, very beautiful place, and I'll be there for almost a month. Yeah, right? And so this is the kind of thing that's possible with Little Dust, in that I'm not stuck in a particular place, I don't have responsibilities anywhere, so I can keep wandering. I'm not going to join the Flying Doctors. I don't think it would be safe for me to either fly a plane or doctor. But I'm going as a monk, as a monk who's volunteering, and there was some concern actually about what the people would think of the monk. I was actually asked, oh, maybe you shouldn't wear your robe, and it's like, well, I've got nothing else to wear. and so I'm going, and I think it'll be their first experiencing a Buddhist monk. But from my other interactions with Aboriginal people, they're really interested in people who have a spiritual practice. And you might be aware that there is an Aboriginal practice called the Diri, which is like a mindfulness practice, an awareness practice. And I was speaking with Bhante Sujato about this the other day. He attended one of the Buddhist Council's recent events, where we're talking to the community about the voice. And one of the Aboriginal elders there was saying that they were working at a girls' school, a boarding school for Aboriginal girls, and they had a lot of behavioural problems. And then they introduced this program of the Diri, this meditation, and all the behavioural problems vanished. Right? And so I'm hoping to learn some of these cultural practices as well. Yes, yeah, it's a country, it's alive, Okay, now I'm starting to think that this is a strategy to stop us from meditating. Been talking a lot about restlessness, so let's. Do you need a break, and we'll do like half an hour meditation? A break, 5 minutes, or you just want to keep going? Just keep going. Okay, very good. If you need a break, if you need the bathroom, you can. Nicely done. It's half an hour of chit-chat that wasn't meant to be.
Very inspiring and diving into very organized.
Yes, thank you. And you can help support by like letting people know what's happening. If you know any communities that I should visit, let me know. I'm really happy. And
Communities that might want to visit.
Yeah, let me know.
My parents are regional rural psychiatric district.
Where are they?
In Victoria at the moment, they're in Rockhampton, and regional psychiatric.
Oh, they're in Rockhampton.
They were.
Oh, right, yeah.
Rockhampton,
Right, yeah. Yeah, there, someone mentioned the other day there's a community of like a bunch of Karen people from Burma who have somehow ended up in some country town in Bendigo, or not Bendigo, in Victoria, and there's quite a few of them there, and someone suggested I should go there and things like that. Maybe it's that community, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I know we want to do it.
I want to.
But to say thank you from all of us that you do.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Tina. That's very kind of you. Yeah.
As usual, if there's anything that
Sorry. Good on you.
Myself can do to help us, let us know.
Thank you very much.
I do a lot of outreach programs, so sense of being a warrior.
Yeah.
So if I do a bit of assistance, sometimes I go out to Bacchus, for example,
Oh, right,
or
okay.
other country towns. If I could do anything there to help that community
Oh,
as well.
oh, lovely. So lovely. Isn't it nice to be surrounded by good people? Okay, so back to our meditation practice. So it's time to settle in, right? To give ourselves a few moments to arrive. So we give ourselves that little gift of time to just settle in, to adjust our posture, to find that place where we feel comfortable and at ease. So take your time developing and building up mindfulness now at the beginning, making your mindfulness strong. Becoming aware of what's going on right here, right now. We'll build up a general sense of awareness. Being aware of the room, the sounds, aware of the people around us, aware of our bodies, the posture we have, the feeling of our body, the touch of the cloth, the contact with our seat. You go through those stages of becoming more comfortable in the body, relaxing and softening, experiencing that tranquility of the body. It feels so good to relax the body, to come to this place of stillness. You see that the mind becomes calm and peaceful when the body is relaxed. The mind is becoming tranquil. And now it's easy to see the breath. This breath coming in, going out. We know, I'm breathing in. We know, I'm breathing out. We're breathing mindfully. You know this is a long breath. This is a short breath. We know. We're experiencing this whole body of breath. This breath helps tranquilize the body even more. To feel good. This breath brings clarity to our mind, brightens our mind, nourishes and gladdens our mind. Feels good. Warm, soft, gentle. We want to stay with this breath, watching each breath come in, each breath go out, completely absorbed in this beautiful breath. This breath will take us deeper into our practice, deeper into meditation, to stillness. And this is the breath that will take us all the way to Nibbana. So for the next 40 minutes, watching this breath, each and every breath, aware but tranquil. Okay, very good. So, whole day of practice and hearing the Dharma, thinking about the Dharma, and it's tempting to think that it's time to go home, right? We're leaving tomorrow, but if we're not careful, our mind will already be gone. And we've still got some time left to practice here. So tomorrow morning, still try to be here on retreat, not planning and thinking and restless for what comes afterwards. And so we'll be here tomorrow morning at 6:30 and do some more meditation, and then we'll have some breakfast, then we'll have some more meditation, and you don't need to pack up or anything like that until after lunch. So just spend the time that you have here, spend it here, being here, meditating and enjoying this beautiful place that we're in. So let's finish off by paying homage to the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha. Araham Samma Sambuddho Bhagava Buddham Bhagavantam Abhivademi Suhakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammang Namasami Supatipanno Bhagavato Sāvaka Saṅgho Saṅgham Namami